Welcome to Squishy Vision. I am going to give probably relatively quickly my thoughts on the entirety of Star Trek Discovery. It's a kind of an end of season wrap up. So, this show, I haven't been doing any live post watch reactions because I started watching the show back before I did these, and when I was trying to populate my blog, and I did some written blogs around it, and I was like, I'm going to continue going how I went along. You can read those blogs at my blog, which should be, I think the main link is in the description below. I forgot to add the direct link to the tag for these blogs. I'll do that after I finish the broadcast. And I basically reacted to each and every single episode in writing. As I was watching them, I'd type up my thoughts. As I'd watch along, I'd make some quips. Um, um, but I figured, I'd end the show with a live reaction, and this is what this is. So it's been a good 7-year run for 5 seasons across 7 years. So it was first broadcast in 2017, 24th of September, and here we are now. The first broadcast on Netflix, because this was pre Paramount Plus or pre CBS All Access. No, no, actually, it first broadcast CBS All Access in the US. In Britain, it got broadcast on Netflix. Then it stopped being broadcast on Netflix, and there was a massive backlash against that. People were unhappy that they couldn't access it because that meant that everyone who was outside of, or at least everyone who was in the UK, couldn't access it. So then there was like a big backlash for anyone who couldn't get to Paramount Plus. So then it got put on for free on Pluto TV. But you had to watch it at a certain time, which was kind of nice actually. It was kind of a callback to nice old terrestrial TV kind of stuff. And then obviously Paramount Plus came to the UK, and for the last few seasons we watched it in the UK, and I think it's all on Paramount Plus now. And Star Trek Discovery, look, whether you like it or not, we wouldn't have the Star Trek era we are in now without Star Trek Discovery. Before then, all we had to bridge the gap or to go on with was the Kelvin films. I think. Oh, when is Star Trek Beyond released? So Star Trek Beyond actually released a year earlier. So I mean, to be fair, I think we only got Star Trek Discovery because the Kelvin films were doing relatively well. So obviously CBS was like, well, let's make some TV shows and go back to its roots. And that's essentially what happened there. But Star Trek Discovery is what made Star Trek a viable property for TV again. So obviously, by getting Star Trek Discovery, we got Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Deck, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. So it all started with Discovery. It was interesting. I had a rocky beginning with Star Trek Discovery. I think I was mostly critical on the aesthetic. It was. I'm someone who's big on continuity, and the fact that the show there was a lot of futurism, and I still, to be honest, even now when I'm a massive Star Trek Discovery stan, I still maintain that they could have done it a bit better aesthetic wise, and I still have this issue with Star Trek Strange New Worlds, to be honest. The fact that it, like, the design and the tech and the graphics, they all look too modern for a show set pre the original series. Both this and Strange New Worlds do it, it's not as if Enterprise was broadcast in 2005, but it still was able to replicate the Enterprise. Or, well, it was the Defiant, but it was obviously the Enterprise bridge in the mirror episodes, and it looked fine there. So that always kind of took me out of it, and I'm not going to apologize for complaining about that. I still think it was a big issue. But so that was rocky for me. It kind of caused a big issue with me kind of really matching onto the show. There was also, what else was that bothered me? I think the violence also bothered me. I think, and I still also maintain this. I think Star Trek should be accessible to a family audience, and Discovery wasn't. Discovery had violent gore in it. There was a very graphic part where we see the truth of what happened to, gosh, what's her name? Uh, to Ash Tyler. Um, when the whole like torture, which ended up being very kind of ended up being them their conversion into a human, and it was essentially kind of body horror. Um, and that balance continued throughout the entire show. There was loads of like graphic stuff that was going on, lots of like decapitations and blood and gore, and then you get like that happened in Picard, that happens in Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds less so. It happens in Lower Decks, but obviously Lower Decks is animated, so that's kind of the mitigation there. But all of these episodes have, I mean, it mellowed out towards the end, but very much early Star Trek Discovery was 15, and Picard was 15, and Lower Decks mostly is 15, and Strange New Worlds kind of dips between the two. Um, and I was never particularly fond of that because I think Star Trek should be accessible to a family audience because it tells some very important messages, and it does so in a way which should be accessible. And then again, I think that was, and then what was my third issue with the show? I'm trying to remember now. I can't remember. I remember having this petty kind of dislike of the opening title sequence, and then we come 7 years later, and I absolutely adore it. So that was a nice little growth. But those are all like minor. The show, I think the show, I very quickly realized, not even realize it, like acts as if I had to be converted. I had these elements kind of turned me off on the show to begin with, but not in a way which stopped me from watching it, or was maybe critical. It was mostly just a bugbear, but I can still appreciate what was good about the show. And what was good about the show continued to be good about the show. And what was good about the show, it was inherently Star Trek, but it was Star Trek for a modern audience. So a big complaint about Discovery was that it was too dark, or well, one complaint is that it was too dark and too cynical. And I'm like, well, it has to be dark and cynical because this is Star Trek being broadcast in the late 2010s, the early 2020s, and there was a lot going on in the world that really requires a cynical look to properly kind of process. I think people forget that TV evolves and the way we tell stories evolves, and the art that we make in the 90s can't be the art that we make in the 2000s because our audience changes and you move with the audience. And I think the audience that existed in the 90s is the audience that Star Trek set in the 90s was directed at, and that's fine. But I mean, well, the thing is, a lot of the okay, let's get to the root of the issue, and this is I was mentioning this in my last. I was mentioning this in my Dot and Bubble reaction episode reaction. Hello, Elias. I was mentioning this in my Dot and Bubble reaction Doctor Who thing because that was very Star Trek, that episode of Doctor Who. And what made it very Star Trek is that it had a social message towards it, but it was presented in a way that if you wanted to ignore the social element, you could. So a big theme of Dot and Bubble was racism, but you could easily be like, well, they're not racist. They're just entitled and self-absorbed, and when they want to stay within their own community. And it's a way where if you're a bigot, you can very easily be like, well, that doesn't apply to me. And I think a lot of classic Star Trek is like that, where if you're, and this is why a lot of reactionaries still kind of pretend that it's better Star Trek. It's better Star Trek because to them, because they can easily ignore the social message, or they can interpret the social message and be like, well, that doesn't apply to me. That applies to other people. Whereas Discovery doesn't give you that privilege and that luxury because Discovery is very explicit in the text and the dialogue about its message, and people complain about that because like, well, I feel like it's too woke now, or it's too obvious with its wokeness, and it should be more subtle, like classic Star Trek was. But I don't think you can in today's day and age be that subtle because if you are, it goes over people's heads. And I think clearly it didn't work in the 90s because we're still having all the problems we do now. So let's by all means go much more kind of direct with our message. And I think that's what Discovery did. It's what a lot of the other modern Star Trek shows do, and it's what pisses off a lot of reactionary fans. I don't know how you can be a reactionary fan of Star Trek, but that's essentially what's happening there. So a lot of the kind of social messages of Star Trek turn people off because of that, and I think they were right to do what they did. I think they absolutely needed to be a bit more explicit with their sort of messaging. The other thing people complained about was the emotional vulnerability, and the emotional vulnerability of Star Trek Discovery is one of my favorite things about it. It you know, a lot of the classic Star Trek shows were set during times where, you know, it wasn't expected for people to be openly kind of emotional. You know, people acted in a certain way on TV. Whereas with Discovery, you know, they kind of broke up mold and they were more like, no, we're gonna have our characters talking about their feelings and crying and being open and honest with each other, and for some reason that upset people, and I'm never really sure why. And I think the fact that it's like, no, you can have a sci-fi, you can have a show on TV and have your characters be emotionally vulnerable, open, and not have obvious manufactured conflict, I think is great. And I think it's great that, you know, Burnham was vulnerable, open, but still shown to be a very capable captain, and all the other crew are being open. You know, people would cry, people would go to therapy, people would be like, this experience has traumatized me. When everyone went into the future, you know, the whole crew was kind of traumatized by, you know, basically abandoning their entire life. And there was a whole thing about how the entire crew probably needs therapy, and it was pretty open and honest about that, and I really, really liked that. It's hard to reflect on the kind of a 7 year. That's not to say everything is perfect. There were issues. I mean, if you go from my blog, you'll see me point out some of the issues, some of the inconsistencies. Um, I do think Discovery was kind of finding its feet in telling a serialized story. Oh, that was the other thing as well. Star Trek Discovery was telling a serialized story. You know, you would go from part one to the stories flowed into each other. Whereas obviously traditionally Trek was set during a time when TV was serialized. And look, the only reason TV was serialized, not the only reason, but the reason why we did serialized TV more in those days was because it was easier to sell episodes that you could broadcast on other channels. You can do syndication easier if you can sell episodes which are standalone. It means you can sell DVDs which are standalone, and people don't feel like they've got to watch the entire show. Whereas now we live in a streaming era where you used to sell the entire show as bulk, and people watch it in their own time, and so it's expected that people would watch the entire show, not just drop it in, but whenever it was on TV. And I think serialized, you know, and that's applicable to like TV as a whole. Like more of our shows nowadays are serialized. Sorry, more of our shows today are long form shows rather than serialized episodes. They're not as episodic basically. So people just didn't seem to really get that, and they took issue with that. I do think Discovery kind of was needing to like find its feet about how to tell those stories because it still had an arc, and often it would kind of like have an arc in the background and quickly resolve it and move to another arc. I'm trying to give like a big reflection about how the show's evolved across all the seasons, and I'm trying to think way back when in. And it was interesting as well because season one was split across two. Actually, it's very interesting because they broadcast season one of Discovery to sit in the UK. That no, I'm thinking of Agents of Shield. Never mind. Um, They're also shorter seasons than obviously Star Trek traditionally is. So usually the classic Star Trek was like what 30 odd episodes a season or something like that. Whereas, or even longer than that. Whereas obviously these were like 15, 13, 13 and 10. Um, I do think season one had a slow start that then kind of like switched after the mirror universe plot, and then obviously season two had a bit more of a kind of a direct arc, so that was easier to follow. and then season three, season 5 are all set in the future, and they have their kind of arcs. I think season 3 is one of my favorite seasons, and I think a big reason why season 3 is one of my big seasons is it kind of, I think it's a season that fits the time the most accurately, because it's about it's about the fact, it's about hope, and it's about the fact that it's set in a world where the Federation's collapsed, so the Dream has collapsed, and everyone's kind of like infighting, and Discovery comes along with this old pre 22nd century kind of optimism, which inspires everyone to kind of actually work towards a better future. And I think that kind of optimism, in spite of darkness, is what makes Discovery so current. So that's why I think it's kind of good and set in that era. And then obviously season 4, I think, is the most muddled. But I was never really that sure what the theme was, but I do like how it kind of ended, and I do like the addition of Tensia as this kind of particularly very alien species and connecting on that basis. I mean, the whole theme of Discovery is about connection. It's about how you relate to other people and how that kind of informs who you are as a person. I think Discovery does capture the idea of people representing. I think I said this actually in season 1, that Star Trek traditionally has been about the crew going to planets, and those planets that it goes to representing a facet of humanity, and they explore that planet, and by doing so they explore a facet of humanity. Discovery is all about self-discovery. It's all about seeing how the crew react to different circumstances, and by doing that we explore the different facets of humanity. And so because of that, Discovery doesn't need to really be this whole episodic visiting different planets things, because it's more about the evolution of characters when faced by a concept. People complain actually because Star Trek Discovery isn't an ensemble. It's not like it's always has been Michael Burnham's show. It's set around her as a character, whereas obviously other Star Trek shows are set around. I mean, obviously the captain's normally the driving kind of character, but it is equally set around other members of the bridge crew. And sometimes the captain would take a step back, and it would just be the bridge crew who, I remember the bridge crew who'd be like the lead actor of that show. You'd like have different characters taking different leads, like so you different episodes centered around different characters of a bridge. Whereas, you know, a lot of the main cast in the show weren't even bridge crew, or even heads of department. Obviously, you had Burnham and Saru who were, but Stamens wasn't bridge crew. Stamens was basically the spore drive like technician. Tilly was a cadet. Culber wasn't even chief medical officer. I think Tyler was head of security, but like, you know, so and I think the show often figured out that it kept falling back on these tropes of acting as if these main characters were the senior staff, and they weren't the senior staff. So even the show got itself confused. But I'm fine with Star Trek Discovery being set not around a crew, not around a senior staff, but actually particular characters and one character, and like Burnham and Mon, so others. It's fine for a different thing, and I think it's basically exploring Burnham's relationships with Discovering the crew and telling a story through that way. And that's perfectly fine thing for it to do. Because Star Trek Discovery is about exploring these connections, and by exploring these connections, we tell the stories. And it's about connections, it's about being stronger together, and I think it needed to go back to those basics. And so we obviously had season 3 where we lost the Federation, and we had to rebuild the Federation from scratch. And that was a good way to remind us about the ethos of Star Trek from its core. So Discovery very much was Star Trek through and through. It was Star Trek if Star Trek was made from scratch today, is essentially what it was. And it does a good job of being that. Like, I think people need to forget that shows don't need to replicate what's been done before, otherwise it'll be boring. And Discovery very much kind of broke new ground for the franchise there. What are my other thoughts? I mean, this is just me babbling life kind of thoughts. Having finished watching it last week or the week before. at some point I might do an actual proper review. There was a lot of like loose ends that we never really got to, and I think it is the ending of Discovery was very okay. So the ending of Discovery was very very rushed, I think. But that's I think because they ended the show without telling them they were going to end the show. So they ended it just like any other season of Star Trek. And to be fair, this isn't the first time. I mean, this happens a lot. I mean, Enterprise ended the same way. The original series ended the same way. I think only the Next Generation and Next Generation spin-offs, so the ones set in the 24th century, had the luxury of having actual endings. So there were a lot of like arc loose ends that might have been explored in like one final season. So it's a bit of a shame we didn't get that. But I think I do think we end. I think okay. So the difficulty with this season is it's basically this chase, this mystery. Oh well, no, it's not even a mystery. Like we know what. There's no mystery. The whole thing was basically just a chase. It's both two sides. One's technology, and they're rushing towards it, and then along the way they're exploring aspects of themselves. That's basically what the last season is. And we're focused so much on the chase and the mystery that we don't really that not enough kind of focus is given on the prize and what the consequences of the prizes are. So, but currently people are like, oh, this is extremely like powerful tech. Tech we can't get let into the wrong hands. Tech we need to secure. And it's pretty consistent in Star Trek that when they're faced with technology that's like super dangerous, had to destroy it rather than risk keeping it and it being destroyed. It keeping it being taken by someone else. So it seemed like it was always going to end up with Burnham destroying the tech. But because that kind of just happened, like they found the tech and they were like, okay, well, let's just destroy it now. It kind of comes across as anticlimactic. It wasn't, and I'm not saying there needs to be a big debate at the end, but then there needs to be like a debate going through. But we never stopped to actually contemplate. Like people were like, oh, this tech is dangerous. And like everyone kind of like somberly kind of like talk about news in, or like when they were speculating whether this tech would be able to like resurrect people from the dead, people like somberly took the news in. But they didn't stop to debate it, probably, or even discuss it because they were like, well, it's a problem for a later date. And then once they get to a point where it's a problem, Burnham is just like, we're going to destroy this. And everyone kind of nods because everyone obviously knows, well, yeah, it probably is actually the right thing to do. And it's what they were always going to end up doing. But it kind of leaves us as the audience being like, well then... Also, if we didn't really destroy it, if we went to a black hole, which kind of just for a later date, which kind of just like prolongs the problem, right? But you know, I still enjoyed the last season for what it did do. It did have its flaws, and I mean, every show has its flaws. And it's obviously, I mean, and it's interesting to kind of because this is like the first Star Trek that I've lived through, apart from obviously the films, the Kelvin films, because I didn't become a Star Trek fan until 2008 or 9. So everything before including Enterprise had already, like, I think I was only just starting to get into Star Trek when the 2009 film released. So I watched the 2009 film not completely ignorant about what Star Trek was, but I was still like a few like years into the franchise, and obviously now I'm a massive Trekkie and I know much more than I do at the moment. I still haven't finished watching like all the classic Star Trek. There's still episodes I need to catch up on. I watched The Chase for the first time in preparation for this season. So it's kind of interesting because like I'm able to like have a strong opinion on the previous classic Star Treks because I'm able to like look back on them having already released and knowing kind of the arcs of the show, whereas this I kind of went through it, so it's kind of like I don't know how it ends. So I think in the future I'm gonna go back on it and have like a different opinion perhaps. But what else can I say about Star Trek Discovery? I am massive fans of all the characters, and I think they all do like, and I think their interactions with each other are the highlights. They all have such strong and interesting personalities. I absolutely love Paul Stamets. I love Michael Burnham, Saru, Tilly, particularly like those four characters. I love absolutely in their kind of interactions, and I love the kind of the warmth and the genuineness of the interactions and the chemistry. They have brilliant all the characters have brilliant chemistry, and I think we need to focus on Discovery as very much a character-led show rather than a plot-led show. The plot is very much there as a vehicle is very much there as a vehicle to let us explore these characters. Um, and Zora as well as the ship. That was kind of cute. That was very cute. Um, trying to think what other thoughts I have. I think the biggest shame at Discovery is because it jumps forward to be set in the future. It's probably not going to get massively like referred to in future Star Trek things because they're very much setting a lot of the newer shows within the time just after Picard, or rather just after Voyager. And I don't know if they're going to revisit this era. And it's kind of this weird jump where it's like, well, we're setting all these shows now in the middle because we have the end set and the beginning set. Um, it's pretty much it's a weird franchise that keeps jumping around a timeline and deciding it can do different things in different areas. But that seems to be kind of the way now of franchises is that you capitalize on small gaps of space. I'm trying to cast my mind back to to what my thoughts were and to them now because as a reflection, I kind of want to have a big, lengthy kind of thought process here. What else can I say about Discovery? I my favorite. Yeah, I was never a fan of the big collar style thing that Discovery did with its early uniforms. So I'm glad when they kind of got rid of those and using them in modern ones. But then I do agree they look a bit more formal. I don't think Discovery has my favorite uniforms. I think my favorite uniforms will always kind of be the ones set in DS9. The later DS9 ones I think will always be my favorite uniforms. God. What other thoughts do I have? I'm gonna end the stream in 2 minutes. I'm trying to work out what I can end on. Oh, Grunge. Grunge was like the best. Love that cat. Shame I'm not gonna see more of them. And I like how much Discovery kind of avoided a lot of like obvious character conflicts. It did that quite a lot. Like there was a time when I know some people complain about this, but there's a time obviously when Burnham ejected Stamets at the end of season 3, I think. Um, ejected Stamets out of the ship to like save Discovery, and Stamets was like obviously very pissed off about that. And then we start season 4, and they're both fine about it. And people are like, well, where was the conflict? But I'm like, well, it kind of makes sense that you pissed off about something in the moment, and then reflect on it and be like, actually, the captain made the right decision. It turns out at the end to be well, and like I didn't want to have like a prolonged conflict about it. I mean, from a narrative point of view, I guess it's probably not a great, but from a realistic point of view, it's such kind of nice that we're depicting them. We're depicting more kind of realistic kind of relationships in that sense. And again, some pointed out that in this season, Booker from like the get go is honest about stuff he knows. He doesn't hide it for like manufactured conflict, and that's kind of nice. Um, And okay, as much as I complain about the aesthetics of the visuals of Discovery, if it wasn't set during this era, during the era that first season was set, I have no issue. And obviously, once to jump in season 3 to the future, no issue. It always looked beautiful. They went to so many planets, and like the set design was beautiful. You could tell it was high budget. Nothing looked cheap. Everything looked so good. The aliens looked really good. The CGI looked really good. The futuristic tech looked really good. Everything. I mean, some of it was a bit funny, like how they kept teleporting everywhere, but apart from that, like everything looks so good, and so modern. And like you can tell, like I said, it looked like Star Trek if Star Trek was made from scratch in 2017. Um, and there were obviously moments where they tackled current political things in like no uncertain, obvious terms, and I very much should appreciate that as well. What else can I say? Um, no, I think that's all I've got thoughts on. I mean, I came into this stream especially just to be like raw my opinions, and I don't think I've had anything kind of big or coherent to say. But I do think Discovery, it was definitely more coherent than Picard was. I think Picard often kind of didn't quite hit its landing. And Stranger World seems very safe. So I think Discovery does what I kind of want TV to do in it, and I want shows to do. It's not to be afraid about bucking the trend and doing something new and novel, even if it doesn't always land. I'd rather that than it being something safe. But I really hope we revisit parts of Discovery in like future Star Trek things. Like if we ever do reference the future, if we ever do like a time travel thing, or if we ever kind of like it comes up again, I'll be definitely like whooping in excitement. So yeah, I know it's probably one of the most. It's probably the most divisive. Almost, it's probably the most divisive Star Trek show. But I bet you anything, people were divisive equally about Enterprise and Enterprise's first broadcasting. I bet people were equally as divisive about Voyager and Voyager's first broadcasting. So I mean, Star Trek fans are always quite divisive over the shows. I imagine Discovery is going to be the same. But I'm very glad that we had it, and I hope that you know some of that has reached the creators. It's not all been the hate. All right, thanks for tuning in. I have got to go shower and go bathroom essentially, but I'm gonna do a book reaction thing to Ghost Set Watchmen. So as soon as I do that, I'm gonna be back in my first kind of book review reaction. So come back if you want to see me babble on about this book that I've just read, and it's interesting. So see you then.